Bienvenidos a este webinar en el que tenemos el gusto de contar con una oradora distinguida y a quien yo tenía el gusto de haber invitado hace 2 años casi, al inicio de la pandemia, pero pues desafortunadamente el COVID nos impidió tenerla presencialmente. Pero tenemos el gusto de tenerla hoy, que celebramos el Día Mundial IEEE, a la doctora Radia Perlman, quien es una investigadora, trabaja en Dell Technologies, y entre sus muchas invenciones que han dado forma al Internet, está el desarrollo de algoritmos robustos, escalables y de autoconfiguración para tecnologías de ruteo y de redes. Ella es la inventora del algoritmo Spanning Tree, el protocolo que hoy en día se usa para el ruteo de los paquetes que circulan por Internet, y por lo cual es cariñosamente llamada la madre del Internet. Ella ha sido reconocida con muchos honores e incluso es miembro de la Academia Nacional de Ingeniería, está en el Hall de Inventors of Fame, el Internet Hall of Fame, y bueno, dejo con ustedes a la doctora Radia Perlman. Radia, please, we are listening.
Okay, so I should share my screen, right? Okay. Oops. Okay, try to get rid of extraneous things here. So are you seeing my slides?
Yes, we are. You just need to show them in presentation mode. Right.
Yes. Okay, so that's working?
Yes, it is.
Okay, perfect. So this talk is about what exactly is the identity problem. Because somebody recently told me that blockchain with distributed identities solves the identity problem. And so my thought was, what exactly do you think the identity problem is, and how exactly do you think blockchain would help? So that's basically what this talk is about. So what exactly is identity? It's one of these buzzwords that doesn't really mean anything. There's so many different things it could mean. And I really believe accurate communication is very important. So when you use a word that means different things to different people, it's really not useful. So most people think they know what the word identity means. They kind of think they know, but there's a lot of different dimensions to it. Like, what is your name? How do you prove you own that name? How do you make human authentication convenient? And what does a browser need to know in order to authenticate a website? And we'll talk about all of the challenges associated with all of those things. And we'll talk about how, does blockchain actually solve all of this? So names. Names are not unique. They should be. Mine is unique. I'm quite certain I'm the only Radia Perlman on Earth. But you don't have a single name. So the issue isn't how to get a human a single unique name. We have lots of unique names, like your username on every site that you visit, your Twitter handle or your Facebook identity or whatever. Sometimes if you're lucky, you can use the same name on more than one site. Email addresses are sometimes used as identifiers. They're sort of unique, but an email address might be reassigned if you're at a company and then you go away and they hire somebody else with the same name, even though there's a specification somewhere saying you shouldn't do that. An email address can be shared by multiple people. Sometimes a family only has a single email address and they all use it. And it's common for a human to have lots of different email addresses. So how does somebody know whether you're John Smith or Johnny Smith or John.Q.Smith? Typically at a company, the first person who joins, whose name is John Smith, gets the email address john.smith@company.com, and then they hire somebody else. So they have to come up with some sort of variation of the name. So they're Johnny.Smith. So fine, they all have a unique email address, but if I want to send email to them, which one of these am I supposed to send it to? It's extremely confusing. The way I would handle it is that if I were a hiring manager and I were interviewing someone, I'd say, wow, your resume is so impressive and we need someone just like you, but we already have a John Smith, so we can't hire you. And then parents would get more creative, like my parents did with my name. So website names. A website has a name, and that's assigned through DNS. So for instance, Dell.com is a DNS name. So there's lots of different top-level domains where you can get a name. So there's like there's .com, .org, .tv. If you want to get a name, you go to whichever top-level domain you want to do business with, and you say, I would like a name in .com, and the registry says, okay, what name do you want? And pretty much as long as that name is not already purchased by somebody else, then you can have it. In some cases, like I think EDU, which is supposed to be universities, I think you actually have to show that your university name bears some resemblance to the name you're trying to get. And .gov is US government things. And again, you can't just say that you're the Treasury Department, you have to actually be it. But yeah, you can get names and then people sell them. So if you think somebody is going to want to have the name drugs.com, if you get it first, then you can sell it to them for a lot of money. Or people, websites, businesses sue each other to say, I am more deserving of that name. But at any rate, let's say that all that is solved, which of course it isn't. But let's say a website has a name. So the theory is so beautiful. The client machine wants to talk to the website x.com and says, hi, I want to talk to you. Prove to me that you are x.com. And x.com sends a certificate showing what public key is associated with the name x.com. And there's wonderful protocols and wonderful cryptography so that it can prove to the client who it, that it owns that name. And then they can talk via a secure channel. But in reality, so that's the theory. But in reality, usually the user doesn't type in a DNS name, and instead they do some sort of search and they get some sort of obscure URL string. So this is an actual URL string. Now, usually people don't look at the URL string, but even if you were able to find the name in the URL string, in this case, it's I searched for who sells umbrellas on Google, and that's the URL that I got. But even if the user does find the DNS name in the URL, I fell for a scam recently. So I wanted to renew my Washington State driver's license. I knew it could be done online. I didn't know the DNS name. So I did an internet search for renew Washington State driver's license. And I clicked on the top listed site. Now I understand the underlying protocols in the crypto. I was tired and in a hurry, and it didn't occur to me that the top search wouldn't be correct. So this is the top search that I got. Now, I didn't notice that it said ad, but even if I had noticed, often the top search, even though that's the one you want, they also pay to be first in the order, in which case it'll say ad. So just because it says ad doesn't mean it's not a legitimate site. So everything was as I expected. Oh, and by the way, what's wrong with this DNS name? WashingtonInformation.org driver's license renewal. Sounds great. So everything was as I expected. I clicked on the link and there was tabs I could click on for renew license, get a new license, replace the driver's license. And look how happy those people are in the pictures. This couldn't possibly be a scam site with such happy people there. So I typed in, it asked me all the things I expected it to ask, like my address, my license number, and my credit card number. So I typed it all in, and I never got a license as a result of doing this. And I sort of assumed everything was fine, but then the bank fraud department called me and they asked me if these charges were legitimate. Because first they charged $3.99 and the next day they charged $9.99 and then $19.99. And so after I explained to the fraud department, yeah, that was probably fraudulent, they disallowed the charges and gave me a new credit card number. So I was not injured in any way. And as a matter of fact, it gives me a really great example to show us that despite all of these mechanisms and fancy cryptography and protocols and all that, there is no security here. I do not believe I did anything wrong. So scam sites appear first in the search order, either because they pay the search engine company or because they understand what the ranking algorithm is and game the system. They could do that by creating lots and lots of sites that all point to each other. And this particular scam had lots of names. So for all 50 states, there was WashingtonLicensing.org, there was IdahoLicensing.org, but there was also licensing.idaho.org. There were so many of them. I think they eventually shut down that particular scam. At the time, I was trying to think, how can I tell Google that this is a scam site? And I couldn't figure out any way to do that, but apparently enough people got scammed that Google no longer displays the evil sites for that, but I'm sure they'll think of that for other kinds of searches people will do. So the site I should have gone to was departmentoflicensing.washington.gov. How was I, a human, supposed to know that? So I claim that it was not my responsibility to know that WashingtonLicensing.org was not the correct site. So this is a quote from my book. I wrote this quote, and I've seen it on quote boards. I'm very proud of this particular paragraph, and I think everybody should memorize it and take it to heart. Humans are incapable of securely storing high-quality cryptographic keys, and they have unacceptable speed and accuracy when performing cryptographic operations. They're also large, expensive to maintain, difficult to manage, and they pollute the environment. It is astonishing that these devices continue to be manufactured and deployed, but they are sufficiently pervasive that we must design our systems around their limitations. So, that, if any of you are students, take that as a challenge. How do we make things usable in a way that we don't blame the user? So user authentication. A human has zillions of username password pairs. How does a human cope? So let's say that you follow what the best practices are. You have long, complex passwords. You have different rules for each site. Some of them you must have special characters, other ones you can't have special characters. You have to change your password frequently. You can't reuse your password. Don't use the same password at multiple sites or similar passwords. There's no way for a human to cope with that. So, excuse me, there's ways to make this somewhat usable. You can use an identity provider. What that means is, like, one of the choices might be authenticate with Facebook. And if you want to do that, you have to link your identity at this other site, at site X, to Facebook. And to authenticate at X, instead of typing a username password, you can click on authenticate with Facebook. And then through the magic of redirects and cookies, Facebook will vouch for you at site X. But your identity provider can impersonate you everywhere. And if your identity provider is broken into, all users are compromised everywhere. So you could also use a password manager. So browsers helpfully remember all of your username passwords everywhere in the clear, which I love it and I use it all the time, but it is kind of terrifying. So if you forget your password, you just go to the browser and ask it to tell you. But that also means that somebody that breaks into Google, in this case, I guess, knows everybody's passwords, usernames and passwords everywhere. Another possibility is you, as the user, might maintain a file somewhere of all of your username password pairs. You might encrypt this file, or most users wouldn't even bother encrypting it. But if you have malware on your computer and it gets at that file, it can steal all of your credentials, including if you have it encrypted, because in order to use it, it's going to have to sit there unencrypted. So what about biometrics? Biometrics are not secret. If you want to know what my fingerprints look like, you can get them off my drinking glass. So they're not useful for remote authentication. Meaning that my laptop can't say to some remote website, this is what Radia's fingerprints look like. They can be useful for unlocking a local device like your smartphone. Credit cards sometimes use biometrics in the sense that they have pictures on them, but the picture is so tiny and it would slow down the checkout line. So I've never noticed a checkout person looking at that tiny picture to see if it's me. You're supposed to sign the credit card, but nobody seems to check the signature when you're using the card. And again, that would be way too much burden on the checkout person to look at the tiny, tiny space they give you for signing the card to see if it matches what you just signed. I wish that passports were online. It's ridiculous that we carry this piece of paper that if you lose it, especially if you're in a foreign country, you're really in trouble. And it's really valuable for people that want to steal them so they can make fraudulent passports. So what it should be is that you go to the passport control and you don't show them anything. You just tell them what your name is. They type it in, and then all your information pops up on the screen, your picture, your fingerprint. You might also put your fingerprint into the thing. And then you don't have this little piece of paper that would be a disaster if it were lost. So PKI, it's been a concept for 30 years, and it still isn't quite right. So PKI is public key infrastructure. It's sort of the chain of certificates that lets a browser know that they're talking to the right website. So a certificate authority, a CA, signs a message, says, this name is associated with this public key. So when you get a DNS name, there should be a CA that's associated with .com, that you just bought the name foo.com, and at the same time you ought to be able to get a certificate for the name, but they're completely unrelated operations. So first you get the name, And then how do you get a certificate from a totally unrelated organization? So the website purchases the DNS name radia.com. It contacts some other organization, says, I am the name radia.com. And the CA, there's no standard for how this should work, but this is a common way to do it. The CA looks up radia.com in DNS and finds the IP address associated with radia.com, because when I bought the name, I also made sure it got put into DNS and my IP address got put there. So then the CA assumes that if I can receive a message at the IP address indicated in DNS, it assumes that I must own the name. So then it asks me, okay, what's your public key? Here's your certificate. But the problem is that if being able to receive messages at a specific IP address is sufficiently secure, we don't need any of this fancy cryptography stuff. All we need to do is register it in DNS, and then if somebody tries to talk to that IP address, they'll know that it must be the right site. But obviously that really isn't secure enough. So this whole way of getting a certificate after you get a DNS name is kind of broken. Now I'm going to rant about standards. I'm always curious how competing standards that are kind of similar, how they compare with each other. Nobody else seems to do that. If I look at them, there's these two huge specs, all with different terminology for no good reason. So to try to save myself some time, I'll ask an expert in A how A compares with B, and they say, oh yeah, well, A is awesome and B sucks. And then if I ask B, an expert in B, they'll say the opposite thing. B is excellent and A is horrible. So if the A committee hears about ways that B is better, no problem, they steal all of the ideas. So there's nothing inherent about what's inside the A spec. Both A and B are moving targets as they try to make sure that they're better than all of the competing things. They don't care what's actually in their spec as long as they get credit for it as their committee won. So both standards are moving targets. It's really hard to say what's intrinsically different about the two because it can change. So the way I tell people to think about committees, it's natural to think of them as well-educated technologists that are carefully weighing engineering trade-offs. But I say a much more accurate way to think of them is as drunken sports fans, rah, rah, my team. So given that, here's an example where instead of inventing something new, a standards body adopted a syntax that was invented by a different standards body. So ordinarily I would applaud them, but in this case, it was not a good idea. So let me explain. So certificate format. A certificate just says the name Radia has this public key and it's digitally signed by the CA. So what could be more simple than that? Why do you need to reinvent your own format? So the IETF, their working group that was going to standardize their certificate format, decided to base their certificate format on something already invented by ITU, which was a different sports team. And the standard was called X509. So why should it matter? So, how simple could it be? And why am I actually saying it wasn't a good idea for IETF to just adopt the standard of ITU for what certificates look like? Well, the problem with X509 is that it maps an X500 name to a public key. What's an X500 name? Well, it's a perfectly reasonable hierarchical namespace, just like DNS is a hierarchical namespace with components. The same thing X500 is, but it looks a little different. So in X500, each component actually has a type of component. So C equals means what the country is. O is the organization name. OU is some sub-organization within that organization. And you can have as many OUs as you want. And so as many levels of hierarchy as you want. And CN is a common name, which is just sort of ignored. It's kind of a nickname. So X509 would have been a fine thing for the internet to use if internet protocols and users were using X500 names, but they don't. They use DNS names like labs.examplecompanyname.com. So what good is something that maps a string that the application and the user is unfamiliar with to a public key? So here's an example. The human types foo.com or clicks on a URL containing that DNS name, and the site sends a certificate with an X500 name. So the name inside the certificate might be something like C equals US, O equals Attica prison, OU equals death row, OU equals particularly vile prisoners, and CN equals horrible person. So what is your browser supposed to do when the human type foo.com and it sees a certificate with a different name in it because it's a totally different syntax? So one strategy that was used, hopefully it's not still used, but I don't know, by some implementations, was to just ignore the name in the certificate, but still bother validating the math of the signature. So ignore that name, make sure that it is validly signed by the CA. Well, what security does that give? Just the warm, fuzzy feeling that someone paid someone for a certificate. So people invented at least 3 different ways of encoding a DNS name into a PKIX certificate. So one thing they did was they came up with a new category. Instead of C equals, they came up with DC for domain component. And they would encode labs.emc.com as DC equals com, DC equals del, DC equals labs. Or there's a field in the PKIX certificate called alternate name. So you could put the DNS name there. Or you could use the bottom of the X500 name, the common name part, and put the DNS name there. So are 3 ways of doing it better than one? No, because suppose when you try to get a certificate from a from a CA, the CA knows that you own the DNS name radia.com, but let's say it allows you to put whatever you want into the alternate name. It's just going to enforce that in the common name component that matches the DNS name that you somehow proved to the CA that you own. Well, then suppose some browser is only looking at the alternate name. Then again, there's, this is just sort of a security issue. So today's browsers tend to accept a DNS name encoded in either the common name or the alternate name, and they ignore the rest of the X500 name. But do all CAs enforce that you own the DNS name encoded in any of those places? I really don't know. So the next thing I'll talk about is what I call trust models. So it's, what is a PKI? It's a way for me to know your public key. And I'll talk about all of these models. I've given them cute names. So the first model is monopoly, like who is the CA and why should you trust it? And in that model, the world chooses one organization universally trusted by all countries, all organizations, and you embed their public key in everything. Everyone who wants a certificate has to get certificates from that one universally trusted organization. This is simple to understand and implement, but there's a bunch of problems with it. One is monopoly pricing, because the more widely it's deployed, the harder it will be to change the public key of the universally trusted organization if you ever wanted to switch to a different organization, because it's absolutely configured and embedded in all software or hardware. And that one organization can impersonate everyone. So if anyone managed to compromise that organization, maybe finding one employee that could be bribed or tricked or threatened, then everything is impersonated. The next model is what's in browsers, where it comes configured with 100 or so trusted CA public keys. And sometimes the user can add or delete from that set. It does eliminate monopoly pricing because there's hundreds of these. But what's wrong with this model? Well, it's less secure. Before, with the one organization, you had to find a way of compromising that one organization. Now there's hundreds of organizations. If you can find an employee that can be bribed at any of these hundreds of organizations, you can impersonate anybody anywhere, because you can trick that one organization into giving you a certificate saying that you are Bank of America or whatever. So in theory, the user can edit the list of trusted CAs. So this is one way to get a new trusted CA, which this was around for a while, but I believe that this has been changed, at least by the one organization that did this. And now it's almost impossible to add a new CA. So what would happen is you would click on something and it would, you would try to talk to a website, and the website would give you a certificate that was signed by something that your browser didn't recognize as a CA. And so you would get this mysterious pop-up box saying this CA root certificate is not trusted. To enable trust, install this certificate in the trusted root certificate authorities store. Well, that sounds good. I like to enable trust. Sure, install the certificate. I mean, what's an actual human supposed to do with something like this? They shouldn't have to know what a CA is or a CA root is or a certificate is. So another way to get a trusted CA, in Internet Explorer, the list of CAs at the client is really just a cache. It's only some of the trusted organizations. So if a client receives a certificate signed by a CA that's not in the client's browser, the client finds out if the bigger list at Microsoft has that CA, and if so, installs that CA into the list at the browser. All of this without the user even noticing that this is happening. So if the thing that was signed, if the signer of the certificate for the website you're talking to is not in your browser, and it is at the bigger list at Microsoft, it will get imported into your browser. So somebody complained that when you delete a CA from the list in your browser, it comes back, because it would. If you look at your list and say, I don't trust them, and you delete it, well, next time you talk to a website that has a certificate signed by that guy, your browser will say, oh, it's not here. Let's see if Microsoft has it, and reinstall it. So the way that they fixed it was they grayed out the option of deleting a CA from the list. So here you have the list of certificates, and the option to remove it, they just grayed it out so the user can't gray it out. And so that fixed the bug of saying that when you remove it, it comes back. And it fixed the bug because you can't remove it, so it can't come back after you remove it. So the next model is to have chains of certificates. So the CAs that are installed, that are configured, are known as trust anchors. And what you do is you allow your trust anchors to issue certificates for other public keys to also be trusted CAs. So your browser will accept a chain of certificates. So let's say that X1 is a trust anchor, meaning that X1 is installed in your browser and you try to talk to the website Bob. Well, Bob is signed by X3. That's not in your trust anchors, but Bob gives you a chain. X1 says this is X2's key, so great, you trust X2 as well. X2 says this is X3's key, and X3 says this is Bob's key. So now I'll talk about the next model, which I call Anarchy, which is also, generally what's used as the PGP web of trust. So nobody tells the user who their trust anchors are supposed to be. The user personally configures these. You might meet somebody and they give you their public key on their business card, and you might type it into your machine, or you might trust some friend and say, can you give me your trust anchors? I'll copy them into my machine. So anyone can sign a certificate for anyone else. And whenever you have a gathering of nerds, like an IETF meeting, you have a PGP key signing party with some sort of ritual where you say what your name is and what your key is, and people can vouch for you. And anyone who wants to can sign a certificate saying, yep, that's Bob's key. I vouch for it. And then there are public databases of certificates that are both world readable and world writable. So if you have created a certificate for somebody, you can install it into the public database. And if you want to find a public key for a particular name, you start with the trust anchors that you've installed in your own machine, and you explore through all of the certificates in the public databases to see if you can piece together a chain starting from one of your trust anchors to the name that you want. So the problems with this, it won't scale. If you imagine every user on the internet signing on average 10 certificates, that would be like, 10 billion certificates. It would be computationally really difficult to find a path. There would be no practical way, even if you can find a path, whether it should be trusted, because there'll be people that will be personally signing certificates for bankofamerica.com because, with some bogus key to hopefully trick people into thinking they're talking to Bank of America, because the path that they find leads to that key. And with this model, more or less anyone can impersonate anyone. So now I'll get to the recommended model. The CA shouldn't be, this is a trusted CA or it's not a trusted CA. It's not a binary thing. Instead, a CA should only be trusted for a portion of the namespace. So the name by which you know me should imply who you trust to certify my key. So if you know me as radia.perlman.dell.com, you should trust a CA associated with Dell.com to certify that name. Or if you know me as Roadrunner279 at socialnetworksite.com, you should trust Social Network Site to associate that, to issue a certificate for that name and a public key. So whether these identities are the same carbon-based life form is totally irrelevant. So in order to do this, we need a hierarchical namespace. And yes, we have it. It's called DNS. Each node in the namespace represents a CA. So here I'll first talk about the top-down model where everybody is configured with the root key. And if you want to get to xyz.com, you follow the namespace down. So you follow the CA associated with .com, and then you follow the namespace. It will tell you the CA associated with xyz.com. So the root tells you who to trust for .com. .com says who to trust for xyz.com. So it's easy to find somebody's public key. You just follow the namespace, but you still have a monopoly at the root. If everybody needs to be configured with the root key, then again, it would be they can start charging a lot of money for that, and it's becomes more and more expensive to try to replace them with a different organization. Also, the root can impersonate absolutely everybody. So now I'll talk about what I'd recommend. So this is a different model, which was invented by my co-author on our book, Network Security. He invented it in the early 1990s, and I'm just appalled that the world doesn't seem to understand this and do it. So there's two changes from the top-down model that I just described. One is two-way links, which I'll explain on the next slide. And next is crosslinks, which I'll explain after that. So with two-way links, not only does the root certify the key of .com, but .com also certifies the key of the root. Now, why is this useful? It eliminates the monopoly at the root. And your trust anchor can be any CA in the key. You could start with your own key. You could start with xyz.com, so everybody in this organization can be configured with that key. And then if somebody wants to change the root key, it won't affect all of the users in this subspace. At some point, you know, they'll revoke this certificate and point to a different certificate for the root, and just everything happens very smoothly. So your trust anchor can be any CA in the key, and you navigate from there to any place else. So if you start at a trust anchor, which is an ancestor of the name you want to get to, you just go down, and otherwise you go up until you get to the root and then go down to the right one. So what's nice is that if the root, if your trust anchor is the root of your own organization, like Dell.com, compromised CAs outside of the namespace Dell.com won't affect authentication between things in the Dell.com namespace, because the path everybody in that namespace will follow will start at Dell.com and go to the name. So all of the CAs on the path will be Dell CAs. And if the main root for the world changes, it only affects the CAs who are the immediate children of the CA. So as a user way down in the namespace, my key doesn't change, my certificate doesn't change, the rules for path traversal don't change. So that's you know, really a very powerful thing. Only if the CA that certified me changes its key do I need to do something. But then there'll be few enough users that the Dell IT department can hunt us each down individually and walk us through whatever magic is necessary to revoke the old key and certify a new key. So this eliminates the monopoly issue at the root. There's no single compromised CA that requires massive configuration, and the trust chain within a namespace stays within the namespace. The other enhancement is crosslinks. So a cross certificate says that any node in the namespace can certify any other node's key. So there's two reasons for this. One is so that you don't have to wait for the PKI for the whole world to be created in order to be able to talk to other organizations. And you can also bypass hierarchy for extra security. So let's say that two organizations build their own little PKIs, A.com and XYZ.com, but there's no .com. So they can cross-certify each other's keys, and then everybody in this namespace can get to the keys of everybody in that namespace. Also, you could use it, even if there was connectivity, you could use it to bypass some of the hierarchy. So if you don't really trust the root, this little subtree really cares about the security of getting to XYZ.com. This CA can cross-certify, you know, can issue a certificate to there, and then the people in this subtree will follow that link instead of going up through the hierarchy. So that bypasses A.com and the root if these guys don't trust these guys. So the navigation rule says you start wherever your root of trust is. And if you're at an ancestor of the target, you go down. Otherwise, you look for a crosslink to an ancestor. And if so, you follow that. Otherwise, you go up a level. And again, you do all the same things. Now, you might think, well, we've just created the Anarchy model, and we haven't, because you only follow a crosslink if it leads to an ancestor of the target name. You don't go to IBM.com in case IBM knows how to get to HP.com. You would only ever follow a single crosslink because it would get you to an ancestor and then you'd go down. So the advantages of this model is that security within your own organization is completely in your own hands, because the CAs along paths of things in your own namespace will all be controlled by you. There's no single compromised key that would ever require massive configuration. It's easy to compute paths. The trust policy is natural and makes sense, and malicious CAs can be bypassed so that damage is contained. So the bottom-up trust model almost got adopted. DNSSEC, actually Charlie went to IETF and convinced DNSSEC to put in uplinks and crosslinks, but then he stopped going, and somebody in the DNSSEC working group said, wait a minute, what's this uplink and crosslinks? We don't need these, and it got taken out. So it was there for a while. And PKIX has a field in there that's still there. It's known as name constraints. And you could build the bottom-up model or the top-down model or the Anarchy model with the name constraint field, but nobody, and Charlie got that put in so that they could build the bottom-up model, but everyone just ignores that field. So it's as if they took it out. So now I'm going to get to, will blockchain solve all of this? So my personal rant is, too often a new thing gets introduced and people start writing up standards with what the format should be and jargon for this thing, or they say, oh, here's a thing, what can I build with it? And I say, no. Instead, start with what problem are you trying to solve? And then look at various ways of solving the problem, compare them, and what are the trade-offs? So let's look at to see what blockchain will do. So first of all, as I said, I heard someone claim that distributed identities using blockchain solves this problem. So what is blockchain? It's not actually well defined. So if you're a little confused about what it is, that's fine. So one way of thinking about it, which a lot of people do, is that it's a magic thing that solves everything, especially if it's security related. So if you have any sort of, your house is insecure and keeps getting robbed, well, add blockchain and your problem is solved. But a more realistic way of thinking about blockchain is that it's a database that's append only. You can only sort of add things to the end of it. It's world readable. It's stored and maintained by lots of anonymous nodes very expensively. So what would distributed identities using blockchain be? So I've simplified that concept down to what it really is conceptually, and I probably also improved it. So names are hierarchical, with the top level being which namespace. So you'll have a different blockchain for each namespace. So it'll be just like a top level domain in DNS. So it'll be namespace : rest of name, where the rest of name is a name within the particular namespace. And instead of going to an organization like you do with DNS to buy a name, instead you look on the blockchain to see some sort of string within that namespace that's not yet used. And if so, you just claim it and you say, okay, I want to have that name. So names are first come, first served. Nobody's in charge. So you grab a name and you put that and your public key on the blockchain. And maybe you have to pay some money to do that. So what subset of identity is this solving? The only thing that it's solving is getting a name and a key. But getting a unique ID is not a problem. We have lots of unique IDs. We have several email addresses, your username at each website, et cetera. And the current DNS is somewhat distributed because you can choose which top-level domain you want to deal with. A public blockchain is very expensive, among other issues. And names become meaningless strings, even more so than today. Names, my first example today showed how WashingtonLicensing.org, I mean, that even though that sounds like it means something, it doesn't really. But with this model, it's even less meaningful. Now, once you get a name in this kind of thing, it doesn't say how you map that to a DNS name, so you can use DNS in order to map to an IP address. It doesn't help you to know the name of someone you want to talk to unless there is some infrastructure on the net that will give you an IP address so you can actually get packets to it. Maybe they're planning to have a whole other DNS-like thing to map these names to IP addresses. But it does avoid CAs if when you get your name, you put your public key on the blockchain. And in theory, the blockchain can't be modified, so you wouldn't need certificates. But since the name is a meaningless string, you could just have used your public key as your identifier. And then you could have bypassed having certificates and blockchain entirely, which is way simpler and less expensive. But if your name is your public key, I'm still going to need something that maps a string that I know you by your public key, which means we're back to exactly what we have today. We need some sort of certificate that maps the name by which I know you to your public key. So what doesn't it solve? It doesn't solve how to map between what you want to talk to and the key. It doesn't map between this syntax and the DNS name. It doesn't help the user remembering their own private key or other credentials. And what do you do if your private key got stolen or you forget your private key? So someone pointed out to me that they do have a solution to losing a private key. Because what happens if you lose your private key? You say, well, Radia Perlman has this public key. Let's say that I was lucky enough to get the string Radia Perlman and everyone knows me by that. And now it's on the blockchain that this is my public key, but then I've lost my private key, so I can't use it anymore. I have to abandon that name and get a new name or something. Or if someone broke into my computer and got the private key, they can be Radia Perlman and I can't do anything about it. So someone, once in a talk, I pointed this out and someone said, they do have a solution to losing a private key. I said, really, what? And they said, somewhere, this is listed, it says, saving the private key is essential. You can't lose it. All access and control will be relinquished. Don't lose a private key, please. So their solution is to ask users very nicely not to lose their key. So blockchain names versus the current DNS. DNS, for some reason, tries very hard to prevent you from enumerating all names in a namespace, whereas blockchain would make all the names publicly viewable. I don't really care. I don't know why DNS is so worried about making it possible for people to see all the names. And currently, when a user contacts a website, the website sends the user a certificate. With a blockchain solution, I guess it assumes that the user has the complete blockchain so the user can look up the website's public key. The current solution, a certificate, is much smaller than the blockchain's complete list of all names, so it would be much more efficient. Now, what about a DNS name that becomes evil? If you want people to see all the names, the DNS registrar could make his database conveniently formatted, world readable. And the registrar, well, and preferably even the DNS registrar would also give you a key at that point. So the database of all the names and keys should be world readable. And if the name base is public, you'd be able to see if a different public key is listed with your name, or if your name is omitted, you can sue the registrar. There's no way for this registrar to subtly misbehave. You can prove that you had the name because of the certificate. So back to identity, nothing today is really quite right. Names really are just meaningless strings. Getting a certificate is messy and insecure. The trust path of certificates is really kind of ugly and could be much better if it were the bottom-up model. Human authentication is unusable and insecure. Blockchain and distributed identities won't help. It's amazing things work as well as they do, but there are still gaping security and usability issues. But, you know, if any of you guys are students, having things broken is great because it gives you the opportunity to improve things. So that's it. Thank you very much. Let me see if I can figure out how to stop sharing. So now I can look at the chat session or something if there are questions or anything.
Yes, for our attendees, if you have questions, please use the question and answer button, not the chat.
Okay, there are no questions. Does that mean people followed it all? Okay, well, in that case, I guess maybe we are done. Is that true?
No questions? Well, it's really amazing what you said at the beginning of your talk, that humans are insecure, unreliable, and expensive devices. So I think that's the way it is. So at the end of the day, we have to cope with all these limitations.
Right. Okay, so I guess class dismissed.
Okay, thank you very much for your time today, Radia. And I hope everybody enjoys a happy IEEE day. And please follow us in the rest of the events that are programmed today.
Okay, well, goodbye.
Goodbye, and thank you very much again, Radia.
Okay.